When you look at an ancient Greek amphora, one of those really beautiful terracotta vessels with the black figures painted on them.
Right, yeah, the classics.
Exactly. There's this distinct sense of, I guess, arrested motion. You see a warrior with his spear perpetually raised, or a monster frozen mid-roar, a ship just forever crested on a painted wave. It's clean, it's definitive, and it is entirely static.
Right.
But when you try to take that, two-dimensional mythological perfection and translate it into a living, breathing cinematic experience, you're immediately forced to make a choice about what actually animates the story. Do you focus on the thrust of the spear, or do you focus on the sorrow in the warrior's eyes? And in the 2026 cinematic adaptation of Homer's The Odyssey, the filmmakers decisively chose the sorrow. And in doing so, they have completely fractured the critics.
And honestly, it's entirely understandable why the critics are so divided. I mean, you are essentially choosing between the visceral thrill of the action and the psychological weight of the aftermath.
Yeah.
And historically, audiences seeking out these legends have very, very clear expectations about which of those two things they're buying a ticket to see. Like if you're listening to this and remembering the breathless, action-heavy blockbusters of the early 2000s, you need to throw that expectation entirely out the window before watching this film.
Which is exactly the tension we're exploring today. Does grounding a timeless epic in this somber, modern character drama elevate the myth to new heights? Or does it just strip away the thrilling, adventurous grandiosity that made the story legendary in the first place? I am arguing that the film's character-driven, trauma-focused approach successfully reinterprets the myth for a new generation. By exploring what heroism looks like when it's, stripped of its glory, the filmmakers found really the only authentic way to make an ancient king's struggle resonate with a modern audience.
And I will be arguing that while the visual ambition of this adaptation is undeniable, truly undeniable, the film's deliberately somber tone and reflective pacing critically undermine the epic's momentum. I believe we're left with this disjointed cinematic experience where the sweeping mythological elements and the intimate, really heavy character development are constantly clashing.
Well, let's start with how this film actually reframes Odysseus' struggle, because I think it fundamentally changes the way we view the character.
Sure.
The casting and the incredibly layered performances take the psychology of the aftermath seriously. And how does the film show us this? It starts in the very first frame.
Right, on the ship.
Exactly. We don't see a triumphant hero leaving the conquered city of Troy waving to the crowds. We see a man collapsing on the deck of his ship, visibly haunted by the blood on his hands. We aren't just watching a clever tactician outwit monsters. We are watching a profoundly flawed man wrestling with severe trauma, deeply rooted pride, and this agonizing longing for home.
Look, the ambition behind that choice is clear, but ambition does not automatically result in cohesive execution. The tone leans incredibly heavy. I mean, far more somber than adventurous. Let's look at the source material, okay? We're talking about a narrative that features the wrath of the sea god Poseidon, a terrifying encounter with a cyclops, the fatal lure of the sirens.
Right, the hits.
The greatest hits. Yet the pacing is so persistently reflective that it actively alienates audiences who are rightfully looking for the epic momentum inherent to a mythological voyage.
But what is epic momentum in a modern context? I mean, I think we need to look closer at what that pacing actually achieves, exploring themes like the cost of ambition or how a person navigates the devastating consequences of their choices. That requires a deliberate, slower pace. Adapting a myth is in many ways like translating ancient poetry.
Okay.
You sometimes have to change the literal rhythm of the text to capture the true emotional weight for a modern reader.
See, I come at it from a different way. I don't disagree that modern audiences demand psychological depth, but I fundamentally reject the premise that psychological depth requires a sluggish narrative. You mentioned translating poetry.
Yeah.
If you translate a rollicking, rhythmic sea shanty into a slow, mournful dirge, you haven't just translated it. You have fundamentally altered its genre. Prioritizing somber reflection over the journey's inherent thrill forgets why these stories survived oral tradition in the first place.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently.
I don't believe the genre has been violated at all. I believe it has matured.
Matured?
Yes. If you rush from the Cyclops to the Sirens to Scylla and Charybdis without pausing to let the psychological toll of those encounters breathe, you're not making a movie about a man. You're making a theme park ride.
Oh, come on, a theme park ride? A film adapting the Odyssey requires a baseline of momentum. When you strip away the adventurous grandiosity to focus almost exclusively on trauma, you are pulling the engine out of the car to admire the mechanics. But the vehicle no longer moves forward.
Viewers who are expecting the non-stop, thrilling action that defines an epic journey are going to find these extended sequences of somber reflection incredibly slow.
But I don't believe the engine has been removed. I believe the filmmakers have swapped a really loud combustion engine for something that runs much quieter, but with just as much torque.
And I don't know about that.
The momentum is internal. Look at how the director handles the framing during the open sea sequences. We are often denied those wide, majestic establishing shots of the ocean. Instead, the camera stays locked in these tight, claustrophobic close-ups on Odysseus's face, even when the ship is navigating massive storms.
Right.
The director forces us into his headspace. The pacing reflects the sheer exhaustion of a decade at war, followed by a decade lost at sea.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. That internal momentum hits a brick wall the moment a literal sea monster shows up.
Oh, here we go.
No, really, this is where the conceptual clarity begins to fracture, meaning the movie doesn't seem to know what it wants to be. How does the film reconcile this quiet, claustrophobic trauma with a 50-foot cyclops? It struggles. The transition between gritty psychological drama and blockbuster sea monster spectacle is rarely smooth.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on that clash between spectacle and drama. Look at how the film updates the thematic nuance of those exact moments. Take the encounter with the Cyclops, Polyphemus.
Okay.
In older adaptations, he's just a roaring beast, right? A physical obstacle to be stabbed. Here, the film gives him a distinct, almost tragic personality. The lighting in the cave sequence is dim, almost melancholic, and the dialogue reveals the creature's brutal isolation before the violence ever begins.
But does making the monster tragic actually serve the scene? I mean, making every monster a psychological mirror sounds phenomenal in a screenwriting seminar, but on the screen, it compromises the sheer primal terror that is supposed to drive the survival narrative.
I don't think it compromises it at all.
It does. If the Cyclops is a tragic figure of isolation, and Poseidon is a manifestation of uncontrollable grief, suddenly the protagonist is no longer fighting for his life in a hostile world. He's just navigating a very expensive, CGI-enhanced therapy session.
Wow, okay, that's incredibly reductive. By giving these divine and mythological antagonists distinct personalities and thematic weight, the filmmakers aren't overshadowing the human drama. They are using the spectacle to enrich it. Take the Sirens. This is perhaps the most brilliant sequence in the film. The lure of the Sirens isn't just physical temptation or a beautiful song. The film visually demonstrates how they weaponize Odysseus's deepest regrets.
Okay, well, let's unpack that scene. What exactly does the audience see?
When Odysseus is tied to the mast, the auditory hallucination he experiences isn't some angelic choir. He hears the voices of the men he left behind in Troy, and the men who have drowned on the voyage, actively blaming him for their deaths.
Yeah, it's intense.
The camera spins around him, and we see the rotting apparitions of his own crew reaching out from the waves. It's an illusion that preys entirely on his internal guilt. The monsters are external manifestations of his internal struggle. It's a perfect synthesis of myth and psychology.
That is a fascinating thematic choice. But again, look at the execution. The film halts the physical danger of the ship navigating treacherous rocks to deliver a slow-motion guilt trip. The people who came for the epic are bored by the slow, reflective nature of the hallucination, and the people who came for the intimate character study are jolted out of their immersion when the actual physical harpies swoop down to attack the ship seconds later.
I wouldn't call it tonal whiplash.
It creates massive tonal whiplash. It divides the audience because it fails to synthesize two very different cinematic languages.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes that awe and introspection are like mutually exclusive cinematic languages, which they are not. We have to look at the actual sensory execution of the film. the visual and auditory craft. This is arguably the film's strongest element. The visual ambition is staggering. What prevents that disjointed feeling you're describing is the heavy reliance on practical effects.
I will readily concede that the blend of practical and modern visual effects is highly effective. The world building is a triumph.
Exactly. The filmmakers resisted the urge to paint the entire supernatural world in glossy, weightless CGI. When Odysseus hides in the Cyclops' cave, the dirt on his skin, the heavy shadows cast by the firelight, the physical presence of the threat, it all feels entirely real. It has a tactile, grounded feel. And this visual reality is anchored by the structural decision to expand Penelope's role in Ithaca.
I want to talk about Penelope, because her expanded storyline is a massive contributor to the pacing issues.
But it's essential. She is no longer just a passive symbol of fidelity waiting by a loom. The film gives her immense agency.
Right.
We actually see how she navigates the treacherous political reality of an Ithaca without its king. She isn't just fending off suitors with a clever weaving trick. We see her actively negotiating grain shipments, threatening trade embargoes against the neighboring islands to keep the suitors at bay, and essentially preventing a literal coup. This anchors the film's emotional core in the real world.
I'm not arguing against giving Penelope agency. The actress delivers a phenomenal, commanding performance. My issue is how her scenes are deployed mechanically within the film.
How so?
Every time the momentum begins to build on the ocean, say, Odysseus is finally catching a favorable wind after a grueling escape, the director cuts back to a slow, methodical political negotiation in a dimly lit hall in Ithaca. It repeatedly kills the velocity of the primary journey.
Look, I will admit that a few of those transitions feel a bit jarring. Like I found myself momentarily taken out of the narrative when we cut directly from the visceral intensity of the underworld sequence straight back to a quiet council meeting in Ithaca. But that minor friction is worth it for the broader thematic resonance.
Is it?
Yes, because her struggle mirrors his. The craft itself bridges the gap between myth and reality, and the score does the exact same thing.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered how those exact auditory choices might actually be exacerbating the film's dragging pace?
The score is brilliant. The composer mixes traditional orchestration, the sweeping strings and horns you expect from a historical epic, with these atmospheric modern textures. It creates a sense of ancient grandeur infused with contemporary tension.
You praise the atmospheric modern textures, but let's translate what that actually sounds like in the theater. In practice, what we often hear are low, droning synthesizers and drawn-out, discordant tones playing over scenes of travel and preparation.
Well,
Think about the sequence where the remaining ships depart the island of Elis. It should be a moment of tentative hope. Instead of building anticipation, these modern, droning textures contribute significantly to the somber drag of the film.
Because there is no real hope in that moment. The men are exhausted, and the auditory dissonance, the heavy, brooding tones laid over the bright Aegean Sea, forces the audience to feel the psychological weight they're carrying. It's exactly like trying to watch a beautiful travel documentary while listening to a funeral march. Your brain feels the profound wrongness of their situation. The sea isn't an adventure anymore, it's a prison.
But cinematic empathy does not require the audience's experience to be exactly as grueling as the protagonists. When the score is constantly telling the audience to feel a sense of dread and melancholy, it robs the film of its vitality. It feels exhausting.
Exhausting or demanding. I think we often confuse a film that demands our emotional endurance with a film that is poorly paced.
There is a fine line between a film being emotionally demanding and a film being tedious. And I think this brings us back to the question of who this film is actually for.
Right.
The marketing promised an epic adaptation of Homer. What was delivered is undeniably perfect for fans of character-driven historical dramas. Anyone who deeply appreciates meticulous cinematic world-building will find something to love.
And that is a massive demographic of filmgoers.
True, but for the general audience expecting a fast-paced blockbuster, the people who want to see the cunning of Odysseus in action, the thrill of the escape, they are going to find the pacing reflective to the point of being stagnant. If you want the breathless momentum of a traditional myth, this film leaves you stranded on the island of Calypso for far too long. The adaptation simply spends too much time dwelling on the sorrow.
I think it's perfectly fine that the film challenges those blockbuster expectations. If an audience wants a fast-paced action movie, there are countless superhero franchises available that deliver that exact formula. But the Odyssey is arguably the foundational text of Western literature. It deserves a treatment that respects the profound depth of its themes.
The problem is not that it explores those themes. The problem is that it allows the exploration to halt the narrative.
But the exploration is the narrative. The film asks incredible necessary questions. What does heroism look like when it's stripped of all its glory? How do we live with the consequences of our survival? Why do these ancient stories still resonate today? By focusing on the heavy, uncomfortable reality of those questions, the 2026 adaptation elevates itself from a simple recounting of events to a poignant commentary on the human condition.
You can explore the cost of ambition and the consequences of survival while still maintaining narrative velocity. Think of the great cinematic epics of the past. They managed to deliver profound thematic resonance without sacrificing the thrill of the journey. When the mythological elements, the very things that define the story as the Odyssey, are relegated to being mere thematic set dressing for a trauma study, I believe the adaptation has lost its way.
I don't see it as set dressing. I see it as recontextualizing the myth so it actually makes sense to a modern viewer. We no longer view war and conquest as purely glorious endeavors, so why should our cinematic heroes experience them that way?
Because there is still immense value in the classical understanding of cunning and triumph. By filtering every single magical or terrifying element through the lens of Odysseus's personal guilt, you shrink the scale of the world.
Shrink it?
Yes, Homer's world was vast, terrifying, and completely indifferent to human suffering. The gods and monsters didn't exist just to teach Odysseus a lesson about his own hubris. They existed because the world is full of chaotic, uncontrollable forces. The 2026 film makes the universe too small by making it all about one man's internal psychology.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I don't think it shrinks the world. I think it magnifies the human element within it. By making the external threats mirror his internal state, the film suggests that the most terrifying, chaotic forces aren't out there on the ocean. They are inside our own minds. And frankly, the performances carry that immense weight beautifully. I mean, we both clearly agree that the casting and the acting are universally strong.
Yes, absolutely. The performances are universally strong. The decision to portray Odysseus as a deeply flawed man provides an emotional anchor that is undeniably powerful. The cast elevates the material, bringing a nuanced humanity to figures that could easily have remained flat archetypes.
And the visual execution, the sweeping landscapes, the tactile dirt and grime of the practical effects, it creates a Mediterranean world that feels incredibly real even when the supernatural bleeds into it.
I cannot deny the cinematic craft on display. The world building is breathtaking. I just maintain my critique that the somber tone and reflective pacing create an experience that is far too heavy and disjointed. It is a film that demands immense patience, potentially alienating fans who love the vibrant, adventurous spirit of the epic tradition.
And I maintain my position that this film is a bold, thoughtful, and visually rich adaptation. It's a piece of art that deeply honors its source material precisely because it is brave enough to carve out its own identity for a contemporary audience. It respects the legacy of the epic, but isn't afraid to confront the gritty, painful reality of the journey.
It certainly provides a deeply specific interpretation, one that will likely be debated in film circles and literature classes for years to come.
Which ultimately proves something quite beautiful about these ancient stories. They still resonate today precisely because they are robust enough to endure such vastly different cinematic interpretations. From the static figures on an ancient amphora to the complex, emotionally laden characters on a modern screen, the myth continues to evolve. The true value lies not in finding one definitive version, but in exploring these multiple perspectives. We leave it to you to decide if this 2026 adaptation is a compelling journey worth taking.